Chapter 441, Phaz. Chapter 441, Phaz. As we broke through the barrier, Zephyrion led us toward what appeared to be a massive city. My mouth hung slightly open as I tried to hide my amazement. The city the deity was taking us to was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Even from afar, I could still make out the large structures and tall buildings. For a brief second, a faint, distant memory flashed through my mind, one of a city bustling with life before it quickly faded. What is that? Even Enos was shocked and couldn't help but ask. Lost chuckled by his side and replied, "What do you mean? That's a city, silly." "A city," she says, Sidis muttered by my side. "I've never seen one that big." "It doesn't look like a typical mortal city," Emmy added, her eyes sparkling in wonder. "It doesn't look like a celestial city either," Brita joined in on the conversation. I subconsciously nodded at that. The city we were approaching seemed to house both dragons and deities, along with some other strange creatures. Zephyrion turned to look back at us and explained with a knowing tone, "Phaz is unlike other places. Here, everyone lives side by side." "Phaz, is that the name of the city?" little Essie asked, her voice laced with excitement. "Yes, it is," answered the masked deity. "Aren't there any problems with that? I mean, I know things aren't as tense between us and gods outside of the main plane, but still," I paused, taking a glance at the city that was growing larger the closer we got to it. "Is it really okay?" I asked. "I'm not sure how things are in the main plane, but here, we do things differently." "Oh, I can't wait till you meet my mom," Lost added excitedly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible at the moment," said Zephyrion with a shake of his head. "Ah, what happened?" Lost frowned. The icy aura flickering around her intensified. "She left Ainez on a mission," he answered calmly, unperturbed by her sudden change of aura. Lost's mood seemed to go down. "Was she not worried about me?" she mumbled. The deity awkwardly scratched his head before answering. "She said that no offspring of hers would die easily, and that you will eventually find your way back." Hearing that, Lost's downcast mood did a full 180. "Of course. I'm not a weak child anymore." Seeing that she wasn't feeling so down anymore, Zephyrion nodded in satisfaction before he turned to address us. "You will be meeting with the leaders." "The leaders of Phaz?" I asked. "Is it something akin to a council?" "A council? No, nothing of the sort. The city only has two rulers, a dragon and a god," he explained. "You'll understand soon enough." It didn't take us long before we were flying above the city. The architecture was odd but held a strange sense of allure. A lot of the tall towers had open ceilings, and I could see a few dragons nestled at the top here and there. There were also massive mansions that emitted thick amounts of divine energy, clearly houses that belonged to the gods. The strangest part of it all was that all of this was built next to each other. I turned to look at Brita, and it seemed like my goddess friend was having a hard time believing her eyes as well. I didn't blame her. It truly looked like both sides were living in harmony. I personally held no animosity towards the deities. Not to mention, after joining the war efforts, I had fought alongside countless gods and goddesses. Brita was different, however. Her hatred toward dragons may have mellowed down, but she had lived through a time of war between both races. Seeing them living side by side like this, I'm sure it was shocking. "Are you okay?" I couldn't help but ask. Brita turned to me, and I could see a rare, helpless smile grace her face as she spoke. "Yes. I'm just wondering, what was the point of it all?" Shaking her head, she quickly continued, "Never mind. I'm all right." I didn't have time to reply before Zephyrion spoke up from the front. "We are here." Hearing his words, I glanced downward at what could only be described as a monumental open temple. It somewhat reminded me of the King's Temple, back on the Royal Road, except this one was completely white. Following the masked deity's lead, we landed by the entrance. He gave us a short bow and motioned for us to go inside. Lost moved aside next to him and gave us a small wave with her tail. "I'll be waiting for you to come out," she said. "You're not coming?" asked Enos. "No, I can't. Only those invited have the permission to go inside," she explained. Enos didn't seem convinced but still gave a forced nod. I gave Zephyrion a short bow and led the way, the others following behind me. Once we were inside, a strange feeling washed over me. It felt as though I passed through a barrier of sorts. I was momentarily confused. I was sure the temple was an open one. It looked like it from the outside, but what was this overwhelming amount of cosmic mana doing here? And why was there a completely different sky? Raising my head, I came face to face with an unfamiliar sight of cosmic bodies. Planets I have never seen before, floating dangerously close to us, along with strange stars. I wasn't the only one surprised, as gasps escaped from my siblings. Brita was no different. Her body tensed as her fingers subconsciously reached out, ready to summon her spear at a moment's notice. Lowering my head, I scanned our surroundings. We were in a vast open hall. Some sort of spatial spell? It didn't make sense otherwise. Now what? Asked Enos. I shrugged in reply, just in time to feel a sudden change in the mana. I turned my head to glance behind us, and two large doors suddenly opened, from which a dragon and a goddess stepped out. Were the theatricals really necessary? I inwardly wondered, but refrained from speaking my thoughts. The dragon was old. I didn't know how I could tell, but he was very old. His scales seemed to have lost their luster and were dull gray, while the goddess was no better. She looked like a frail old woman, with wrinkly skin and a hunched back. Welcome to Foz, younglings. Chapter 442, History. Chapter 442, History. Thank you, I answered, and lowered my head slightly in a show of respect. My siblings, along with Brita, did the same. The goddess nodded her head contentedly and glanced at the old dragon to her side. His green eyes flashed with a streak of mana as he scanned us one by one before speaking. "The Void Walker?" he said with a chuckle as his gaze came to rest on me. I tilted my head in confusion and was about to speak when he suddenly continued, "My name is Irvai." He paused and looked at the old goddess. "You can call me Kalta," she said with a slight smile. "It's an honor to meet the leaders of Foz." I lowered my head slightly. Sidis, by my side, seemed a little bit on the edge as he kept glancing at our surroundings. Imi, perhaps infected by his mood, had a hard time controlling her aura as well. Brita kept her eyes on Kalta with a slight frown, her hand itching as she kept reaching for her non-existent spear. "I never thought I would see a cosmic pillar grace these lands in my lifetime," said the old goddess. Irvai looked at Sidis and Imi and continued, "Not only one pillar but three," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. The goddess nodded. "And they are all related." "Fascinating, really." "The first one was lucky enough to survive," Irvai said as he eyed me from head to toe. "So the other ones managed to tag along as well." He continued as he turned his attention to Sidis and Imi. "Well, was it truly luck considering who their grandfather and grandmother are?" asked the old goddess. Irvai scoffed. "Perhaps true luck would have been if they all died in their rite of passage." Their conversation made me frown. Sidis and Imi didn't look all too happy either, while Enos was forcefully calming himself down from doing anything stupid. Brita, on the other hand, was scanning the open temple for any exits. I didn't like the way they were talking about us, as if we weren't here, but there was nothing we could do for now. We were in their territory, and not to mention, I doubted we were strong enough to handle both of the old monsters. Perhaps I could teleport us all away, but even that was debatable. I thought as I looked at the various planets floating right above us. The cosmic mana that was surrounding this temple was not something I could control. Someone left it behind. The previous pillar, I assumed. Besides, I still had so many questions I wanted to ask. Now, excuse this old fool. His words may be sharp, but he means no harm," said Kalta. Irvai shook his head and answered, "It's true. It would have been mercy if they didn't survive." Hearing that, Enos seemed on the verge of exploding, so I hastily spoke up, "You keep on saying that, but what do you mean exactly?" Irvai's green eyes turned to look at me. His gaze was deep and unfathomable. Throughout all the years, there had been no instance where all pillars survived their rite of passage. He turned to look at Sidis and Imi before continuing, not to mention being all from the same family. "But what exactly is the problem with that?" I asked hesitantly. "The problem," he says, he chuckled and turned to look at Kalta. "Higher powers are at play, child. Some say there is a reason why all the pillars can't be alive in the same generation," she said. Irvai shook his head and turned, making his way toward the end of the open hall. "Come along," said Kalta with a smile. I glanced at my siblings and Brita, who all seemed to be on the edge. "Stay close. It's okay," I spoke, trying to reassure them. A sudden portal opened before Irvai. My eyes widened slightly at the familiar aura. Just who built this place? And why? I wondered. The temple didn't look like it was meant for the king. If not, then what was it for? Irvai's figure disappeared as he walked through the portal, followed by Kalta. I only took a second to brace myself before I followed behind, Brita and the others right next to me. The world changed around us as we walked out of the portal. I took a moment to gather my bearings as I scanned our surroundings in curiosity. We found ourselves in a massive, dimly lit cave with murals on the walls. Faintly glowing crystals illuminated our path, where Irvai and Kalta stood before us. They waited until everyone walked through the portal before Irvai motioned toward the mural to our right. There was an old drawing of a massive black dragon with golden eyes. Seeing that, I almost instinctively knew it was the king I was looking at. Sidis, Imi, Enos, Essie, and even Brita had expressions of shock as they approached the mural. The ancient drawing held a faint aura of power, making it hard to stare at it for a long time. Irvai and the goddess didn't say anything. They just calmly waited for us before they walked ahead. Shaking my head out of the strange reverie I found myself in, I quickly followed behind them, my gaze glued to the cave wall. The next mural depicted a picture of the king with 3 glowing orbs before him. One black, one white, the last one purple. The pillars? I continued walking. The next mural showed a picture I was faintly familiar with. It was a battlefield. 3 dragons stood at the forefront, battling against a horde of shades. One was black, the other white, and the last dragon was purple. I thought you said there was never an instance where all 3 pillars survived their rite of passage? I subconsciously asked as I glanced at the mural. Irvai chuckled before answering. Those were the primordials. They needed no rite of passage, child. The primordials. Sidis and Imi seemed to be in just as much shock as I was looking at the mural. The next mural was a drawing of the king's massive figure looming in the back, while the 3 pillars stood below him as guardians. Aren't there supposed to be 4 pillars? I couldn't help but ask. Irvai didn't answer. He shook his head and motioned for us to continue. The next one was another battlefield. The pillars fought off against all manners of monstrosities, with the king watching over everything from the back. Who made these? I continued to the next mural, only for my steps to falter in shock at what I had seen. What? Chapter 443, History 2. Chapter 443, History 2. What does this mean? I turned to look at Irvai and Kalta. The goddess sighed and shook her head while the old dragon's green eyes stared deep into my own. Are you blind, child? He asked. Wadash flustered. I didn't know how to respond before he continued. The scene before you is as clear as day, he said. But that's... Sidis and Imi appeared as disturbed as I was when we looked at the mural. It depicted a drawing of the 3 pillars attacking the king, making me question everything I knew. I approached the mural, still in disbelief. Part of me wanted to dismiss the scene I was looking at, but it really was as clear as day. The pillar of darkness was half emerged out of a shadow, his claw digging deep into the king's side. The pillar of light was facing him head-on, a bright orb of light materializing as the dragon aimed to fire it at the king. My gaze went to the final pillar, the cosmic pillar, who seemed busy opening a portal of sorts. What the? Imi mumbled by my side while Sidis stood still in shock. Essie tensed and snuggled closer to me, her eyes wide open in disbelief. Enos, on the other hand, turned to glare at the old dragon and goddess. Brita hesitated for a moment before asking, "Why am I here?" The goddess sympathetically smiled and said, "Your destiny is intertwined with this child." Brita had a complicated expression as she turned to look at me, but I was in no mood to say anything. My eyes remained glued to the mural in an attempt to understand. Just what the hell am I seeing? Brother, get your grip together. Now is not the place to lose your composure. Enos's voice resounded in my head, bringing me out of my reverie. I turned to look at him, and he gave me a slight nod and motioned to Sidis and Imi. Both still seemed out of it. He's right, now is not the time. I don't know if we can trust Irvai and Kalta. Come, There's still more you need to see, said Kalta with a soft sigh. I nodded hesitantly and nudged Sidis. He turned to look at me with a blank look of disbelief on his face. I lightly shook my head. We'll talk about this later. For now, let's try to stay calm. Sidis gave me a deep look before he nodded. Emmy seemed to calm down a bit. Her gaze turned cold as she became wary of our hosts. She glanced at me, seemingly asking for my opinion, and I lightly shook my head. I looked at the mural one final time before moving to the next, maybe because I was mentally prepared this time. But the shock was not as strong. The mural was another drawing of the battle between the king and the pillars. The white and black dragons were heavily injured, and the king did not look good either, with multiple open wounds and broken scales. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but the black dragon was also missing an eye. My eyes subconsciously glanced at Sidis, who seemed lost in thought. What is that? Brita muttered by my side. I looked over at what she was looking at. The cosmic pillar was injured as well, albeit not as much as the others. But what was strange was the portal he had opened. Once I saw it, my heart skipped a beat, and a deep sense of yearning engulfed me. It was hard to say where the portal led as all I could see was darkness. Yet somehow, that darkness seemed to be most inviting. I moved almost subconsciously to look for the next mural, only to pause abruptly. The wall had nothing, no more murals. It ended there. I turned to look at the old dragon and goddess and asked, "Where is the rest of it?" "I'm afraid there is no rest of it," said Kalta. "There isn't?" I shook my head in disbelief. "What was that?" I asked, my voice agitated. "That is ancient history," replied Irvai. "Ancient history, you say? You mean to tell me the pillars turned on the king?" Kalta had an apologetic smile. "I'm sure it's a lot to take in right now. Who made these?" It was Emmy who interrupted us and asked. Her eyes were still glued to the mural that depicted the battle. Irvai's green eyes looked at me and spoke. "An old cosmic pillar did. This doesn't make any sense. No dragon is supposed to hold enough power to threaten the king." Sidis spoke with a deep frown. "Those were no ordinary dragons," said Irvai. He looked at all of us for a moment before he continued, "Those were the primordials. You said that before, but what does it even mean?" Emmy asked. "They were the first creations, the first dragons. Before them was nothing. And they turned traitors, you say?" Enos asked with a tinge of skepticism. "You can choose to believe what you want," Irvai said with a scoff before Kalta spoke. "We are merely doing our part." "Your part? What do you mean?" I asked. "Exactly that, to show you the past," she said. Sidis's frown deepened. "Why is that your part?" A long sigh escaped Irvai's mouth before he spoke. "Come along." Saying that, the dragon and goddess continued on their way, leaving us behind. "Brother, I don't like this," Essie, who was silent all this time, suddenly spoke. I used my mana to gently pat her head and give her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll teleport all of us away the second I feel something is wrong," I said. Essie nodded hesitantly and snuggled closer to me. "How confident are you in doing that?" Brita's voice echoed in my mind. "Not confident at all. The cosmic mana here is not listening to me. I can try to force it, but I'd rather not risk it since we might end up lost somewhere." "This is bad," she replied. "What are we waiting for?" Enos asked. "Nothing, let's go," I replied. As we continued down the cave, we came across another portal. Irvai and Kalta were not here, so I assumed they had gone through it already. I took a deep breath and went ahead. My siblings and Brita followed suit. The world changed once more. This time, we found ourselves in another open hall. The view was breathtaking, with countless stars illuminating the dark sky like precious gems. Kalta was sitting on a golden throne, with Irvai curled around another one next to her. "I'm sure you are all confused, and we'll do our best to explain everything to you," said the goddess in a gentle motherly tone. Chapter 444. The Truth. Chapter 444. The Truth. I hesitantly nodded before I turned to look at my siblings and Brita. It seemed like they were waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath and faced Irvai and Kalta. "First of all, thank you for having us," I said. My words made the goddess smile as she looked at Irvai. "Look how polite." The old dragon harumphed and didn't say anything. "The pleasure is all ours, dear," said Kalta. "I'm sure you can understand our situation." What you have shown us goes against everything we know, I continued. Calto acknowledged. I understand how shocking this can be. With squinted eyes, I asked, can you explain to us the reason behind showing those murals? We are all curious to know, I said, motioning to my siblings and Brita behind me. It is our duty, spoke Irvai. The old dragon scanned all of us before his gaze settled on me. A predecessor of yours created the murals and entrusted us with preserving them for future generations. So the pillars did turn on the king? I couldn't help but ask once more. It's a bit more complicated than that, said Kalta, joining the conversation. Please elaborate, I said. The goddess looked at Irvai, who sighed. Never thought I'd be doing this in my lifetime, he mumbled. The king created the pillars to fight against the shades, he said, beginning his explanation. I nodded. That much was clear from the murals. What wasn't clear, however, was why they suddenly attacked him. These were the primordials, the first beings the king created with unmatched powers. Just 3 of them were enough to hold back the hordes of shades. I took a deep breath, trying to imagine that. I have seen the battlefields, I have joined the war efforts, and I have seen the devastation the shades wreaked across the plains. It took thousands upon thousands of dragons and deities alike to keep their advances at bay. To imagine only 3 dragons standing alone in the face of all of that was ridiculous. At the time, the universe was empty, the plains were empty, and all that existed was the king, the pillars, and the shades, Irvai continued. Sidis and Imi, along with the others, edged closer with their ears perked, listening to the old dragon speak. It continued that way for eons, the pillars acting as guardians for the king, engaged in a never-ending battle against the shades. Didn't the king join the fight? Enos suddenly asked. The king was injured, Irvai replied hesitantly. He created the pillars, giving each one a portion of his power. Their purpose was to protect him as he recuperated from his injuries. The old dragon paused for a few seconds, letting his words sink before he continued. The primordials fulfilled their duties, staying faithful to the king until the very end. I'm sorry, but that doesn't make much sense. The murals clearly showed them turning against him, I said with a shake of my head. Patience, dear. We are getting to that, Kalta spoke, the smile still gracing her face. Have you considered the fact that it was not they who turned against the king, but he who turned against them? Irvai asked, his deep green eyes fixed on me. You mean Dash? My eyes widened slightly at the implication. That's a serious accusation you are throwing there, Sidis lightly growled. Accusation? Heh, Irvai chuckled before continuing. What I'm recounting are merely the records of your predecessors. Don't you find it odd? Kalta asked. Sidis turned to glare at her. Find what odd? When was the last time a grown darkness pillar roamed the universe? She paused and turned to Imi. Or a light pillar? Her eyes then settled on me. Aren't you curious about what happened to the previous cosmic pillars? Damn it, do I have to be here for this? Brita grumbled under her breath, her hands fidgeting as she stopped herself from summoning her spear. Aren't you afraid of what might happen to you, saying all of this? I asked with a frown. The king's eyes may extend across the universe, but not here. The previous pillar made sure of that, Irvai answered. Ever since I went through my rite of passage, few things truly made me feel nervous. Even more so after my second death. Still, as I stood here looking at the old dragon and goddess, my heart couldn't help but skip a beat. It felt as if I was about to hear something I wasn't supposed to. Something that would shake my entire view over everything I knew. I took a deep breath and turned to look at my siblings. Brita's face was no longer indifferent. Her uneasiness was as clear as day. Sidis had a deep frown on his face, while Imi's eyes were open wide in disbelief. Essie was now hiding under my wings. She had no courage to look at the old dragon and goddess, while Enos had a mad grin on his face. Steeling myself for what was to come, I took a deep breath and asked, what exactly happened? A wide grin extended across Irvai's face, his green eyes flickering with frenzy as he spoke. What the king gives, the king takes back. The king can never be whole as long as the pillars exist, the old goddess continued. After fighting for the king and defending him for eons, what awaited the primordials was a stab in the back. The The king tried to take back the power he bestowed them, but that would mean their demise, Irvai explained. Kalta sighed. That's when the battle between them erupted. The darkness and light pillars held the king at bay while the cosmic pillar attempted to open a portal to a new universe so they could escape. But the king was too strong. Irvai shook his head as he leaned back onto his throne. The pillars, sensing their imminent loss, decided to go for a final gamble. The darkness and light pillars sacrificed themselves to injure the king and joined in with the stream of mana, while the cosmic pillar managed to escape with the help of his siblings' sacrifice. Silence descended on the hall as the dragon and goddess finished their story. So the pillars of light and darkness died in that fight, is what you want to say? Emmy asked. They didn't die, Peresi. They joined the stream of mana that flows across the universe, Kalta answered. I don't understand. In that case, can't the king take back their powers, even if they had joined the stream? Emmy asked again with a frown. Not without risking destroying the entire universe, Irvai answered. But the cosmic pillar lived? I asked. Not for long. He eventually joined the stream as well. Chapter 445. To believe? Chapter 445. To believe? So this place, I said, pausing for a second as I glanced at the hall where we were. My eyes faced the open ceiling where countless floating planets were visible before I continued. All of this was created by the previous cosmic pillar? That is correct, Karta answered. The previous cosmic pillar did not wish for the king to recover, she added, her eyes scanning all of us before she continued. This place was one of his many attempts at preserving history from being lost. The chronicles record everything. But they are also the king's loyal dogs, Irvai spat in irritation. They are not to be trusted, Kalta nodded, which is why we had to take matters into our own hands. Aren't you concerned about what we might do? Emmy asked with a frown. You told us all of this. It's treason. Aren't you being too hasty? You do not know us, and I doubt you trust us either, she paused, her eyes staring deep at the old dragon and goddess before she spoke with a frown. What is it that you want exactly? The mood turned tense as Enos, Sidis, and even Essie began to gather mana around them. A suit of armor materialized on Brita as she edged closer to us. My eyes scanned the surroundings as I tried to locate a weak point that I could exploit to seize control over the cosmic mana in case things went south. Irvai harumphed and rolled his eyes. See what I said? This is the problem with children. Oh dear, you speak as if you weren't the same, Kalta answered with a chuckle. Be brother, Essie whispered by my side. Enough, stand down, I said as I turned to my siblings and Brita. Huh? But brother Enos wanted to complain, but I glared at him and replied, I said, stand down? Emmy and Sidis wore expressions of doubt, their eyes flitting back and forth between me, the enigmatic goddess, and the ancient dragon. Brita let out a long sigh, and in a dazzling display, her armor dissolved into a burst of light. Oh, at least one of them has brains, said Irvai. You can't blame us for being on the edge, I replied. You simply showed us some old drawings in a cave, and now expect us to believe that the king is our enemy. Sidis and Emmy nodded by my side. Child, if we wished you harm, you wouldn't have been able to step foot in this hall, Kalta said. We weren't the ones that brought you here. Your mana did, Irvai added. He motioned to Sidis and Emmy and said, they may not feel it as strongly as you do. But you are already one with the mana. You don't need to believe us, but believe in the mana that dwells inside you. Kalta suddenly clapped her hands and spoke. All right, we understand that all of this is too much to take in. So for now, please go and get some rest first. Clear your mind and we shall talk about this later. How about that? I turned to look at Brita and my siblings. They all nodded in agreement, so I replied, that would be for the best, thank you. Great, in that case, we shall see you soon, she answered with a smile. Before we could add anything, the cosmic mana in our surroundings surged toward us like a tide. We barely had a second to react before we got teleported out of the temple. Zephyrion was still waiting for us outside, but Lost was nowhere to be seen. Seeing us appear, he nodded. If you would be so kind as to follow me, I will guide you to your lodgings. Please do, I answered on behalf of everyone. The masked deity jumped into the air, and we all silently followed after him. We flew above the city, passing by occasional dragon and deity before Zephyrion guided us toward a peculiar tall tower not too far from the temple. Following him, we landed on the open roof before he spoke. The inside is bigger than it looks with the help of cosmic mana. Please make yourselves comfortable, and once again, welcome to Foz, he said with a respectful nod. Thank you, I answered absent-mindedly as I sensed the cosmic mana in our surroundings. Zephyrion then jumped once more into the sky and turned into a streak of white that disappeared in the distance. Now what? Emmy asked. I sighed. Let's see what this is all about first, I said, and made my way toward the impressive door shimmering with cosmic energy. The others followed behind me. The second I approached the door, it automatically opened with a loud creak. I didn't feel any ominous presence, and the mana remained silent, offering no warnings. The atmosphere here felt distinct from the temple. I was confident that I could take control of the power of the cosmic mana in this place, and so I took the first step with the others right behind me. The world changed, but it didn't feel like we teleported. No, we were still in the tower. The only strange thing, however, was the inside. The ceilings were too tall, enough to accommodate all of us comfortably. The room had paintings of dragons and even gods. What looked like large sofas were placed all over. In the middle was a table with a map of what I assumed was Foz. Before I could say anything, Enos turned into a blur and rushed toward one of the massive sofas, his large body dropping heavily on it, causing me to wince in fear of it breaking. Surprisingly, however, it didn't. Wow, this is amazing, he exclaimed. Essie eyed everything in curiosity, her eyes sparkling as she rushed after him, jumping on top of another sofa. Wow, it's so soft, she said as she began rolling around. Brita shook her head. She then made her way to a chair in the corner and sat down with a soft thud, leaning her head back and closing her eyes with a sigh. Brother, Emmy looked at me from the side. Sidis's expression was just as grave as hers. I know, I replied, my eyes glancing at Essie happily jumping around. Do you think they are telling us the truth? Sidis asked. I'm not sure, but if they wanted to deal with us, it would have been a lot easier doing it when we were in that temple, I answered. I don't understand. We're talking about the king, Emmy added with a whisper, her voice trembling with anxiety. That's what makes this entire thing all the more dangerous, I replied. We should rest first, then we'll think things through, Sidis answered. I nodded in acknowledgement. Things were about to get a lot more hectic, it seemed. Chapter 446. Emmy and Sidis. POV. Emmy. My eyes scanned the room with a sigh. I wasn't as attuned to the mana as Brother Ether. None of us was. But what could I do? My scales tingled uncomfortably in this so-called tower. Perhaps the others could not feel it, but I was sure at least Sidis did. Although he tried to hide it, his expression still betrayed him. He was uncomfortable, and understandably so. The mana in this place was of the cosmic element. It would have been easier if it had been one of the other four elements. But with it being cosmic and us being pillars, it simply felt like I was in a dangerous situation all the time. I turned my gaze to Brother Ether. He was busy studying the map in the middle of the large table. A frown was ever present on his face. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but he was akin to a fish in water in this place. The abundance of cosmic mana made my scales tingle uncomfortably, and his presence further magnified that feeling. I still could hardly believe my eyes, even with him standing in front of me. Brother Ether was always special. We all knew that. But to survive and come back from the dead? That was something else. I shook my head and regarded Sidis with empathy. It was a significant blow to his pride witnessing Brother Ether's burgeoning strength. Then again, it was a massive blow to all of us. The sound of giggling drew me out of my thoughts as I glanced at little Essie, who was happily hopping on the bed with a wide grin on her face. Well, perhaps not all of us, I muttered inwardly. A sigh escaped my mouth as I turned around to leave. Going somewhere? Brother Ether spoke, causing everyone to drop what they were doing and turn to me. I was planning on visiting the city for a short walk, I answered with a smile. There was no reason for me to show my discomfort. Everyone was already on the edge as it was. Brother Ether frowned lightly. I could tell he wasn't too keen on the idea of us getting separated. It was something I always admired about him. I heard that other draconic families were, more often than not, less agreeable. But he managed to keep all of us together. Although he might not know it, I was sure that to all of us, he was that pillar of comfort. And so I smiled back before he could speak. Don't worry, brother. I'm not planning on going far. I just want to stretch my legs. It has been a long day, after all. Although he didn't look too convinced, he still nodded. Okay, but be careful, and if anything happens, release your mana, and I'll teleport right to you, he answered. I couldn't help but smile before I nodded. It was things like these that made him easy to rely on. I will, don't worry, I replied. I'm going with her, Sidis declared as he rose. Brother Ether raised his brow in surprise and asked, You too? Sidis nodded. Yes, I'm curious about the city, he answered. Okay, but be careful, he reminded us once more. His eyes turned to little Essie and Enos. What about you guys? I'm going to take a nap. Enos shook his head with a yawn. His large body shifted to the other side as he grew more comfortable on the bed. Heh, is he still sulking because Lost is not here? I chuckled at the thought. I'll just wait with you, brother. Little Essie, on the other hand, answered with a cute smile. Brother Ether nodded and glanced at Brita, who had her eyes closed already and didn't say anything. Instead, he turned to us and spoke. I don't need to remind you we are in foreign territory. Both me and Sidis nodded before we took our leave. The door opened automatically with an uncomfortable surge of cosmic mana. Once outside, we both took to the skies and left the tower before landing on the street below. Why did you follow me? I asked with a harumph. Although I already knew the answer, Sidis's stupid face still somehow managed to annoy me. Who cares about you? He grumbled. I just wanted out of the tower, he said. We continued our walk, each of us content to ignore the other, but also not straying too far apart, just in case. The city was quite beautiful. It was unlike any mortal kingdom I had visited before. The sight of so many deities and dragons walking side by side, talking and laughing, was a welcome change. It's pretty. I couldn't help but mumble. Sidis shook his head. It's too bright, he said. I rolled my eyes. There are too many shadows where you can hide. It will still be hard to hide traces of my mana. He shook his head. I nodded. The warmth of the sun on my scales was delightful, prompting me to close my eyes and bask in it for a moment. Despite Sidis's disdainful gaze, I chose to ignore him. I'm going to go that way, he said, motioning toward a darker alley. I nodded absent-mindedly. Stay close by. We'll meet again on the main street. POV, Sidis, who just stands like that in the middle of the road. Like an idiot. I shook my head in annoyance. She was being too obvious. We weren't even sure if we were safe here. And yet she just stopped there. I sighed as I moved between alleys. The shade provided by the tall towers and buildings was a welcome change from the bright sun. My eyes subconsciously glanced back to where I had left her. I could still sense her aura standing there like a fool. No matter. I'm sure I can make it there in time should anything happen. With such thoughts swirling in my mind, I turned another corner only to come face to face with a strange dragoness. I couldn't sense her presence at all. My eyes widened as I crashed into her, sending her to the ground. I barely managed to stay on my feet. I'm sorry. I apologized as the dragoness stood up. Wait, is she even a dragon? The stranger had no wings or scales. Instead, her fur was a light purple with whitish stripes. She had long blue hair that almost seemed to sparkle with electricity, extending from her head all the way to her back. Around her neck, there was a strange golden bell. She looked nothing like a typical dragon, but somehow, I was sure she was one. She stood up with a light groan, almost similar in height to me. That was when I noticed the faint wisps of fire mana circling her. What are you? My eyes widened, and I couldn't help but ask. Now, isn't that just rude? The stranger chuckled sweetly. Chapter 447. New and Old Friends. Chapter 447. New and Old Friends. I apologize, I quickly spoke. I didn't mean to offend you, I added. There was no need to antagonize the strange dragoness. Besides, the fact that she managed to bypass my senses implied that she was dangerous. My eyes subconsciously drifted to where I had left Emmy. The idiot was still standing in the middle of the road, her aura calm and steady. That could only mean she couldn't sense the stranger in front of me, either. That's all right, The dragoness spoke with a smile. I am well aware of how strange I appear, she chuckled. Ah, not strange, I hurriedly replied. I was startled, that's all, I added. The smile never left her face as she nodded. I get that a lot, she said, the fire wisps fluttering lightly around her. I see, I nodded. The stranger stood there, her gaze empty, not quite looking at me. Instead, it appeared as if she couldn't even see me. But that's impossible, right? Well, please, don't let me keep you, she said and gave me a slight nod before she turned to leave. Yes. I moved to the side and watched her walk away. The wisps of fire mana floated before her, creating a strange but beautiful scene. I shook my head and turned around, ready to leave. But part of me was still curious. Excuse me, I called out. The dragoness paused and lightly turned around. She wasn't looking at me, but was instead staring in my general direction. That somewhat confirmed my suspicions. May I know your name? I asked. I wasn't sure why I did, but I was curious. Perhaps it was not a very smart thing to do, especially not when we were in an unknown territory, but I couldn't help myself. The dragoness smiled. Emily, she said and turned to leave. Emily? Confused, I muttered in surprise. That didn't sound like a dragon's name. If anything, it sounded like that of a mortal. Emily didn't wait. She was already close to leaving the alley. I'm Sidis, I yelled out. Bye, Sidis, she replied, her sweet voice fading as she disappeared around the corner. I stood there blankly, staring at where she went for a few seconds. What just happened? I wondered. Was I bewitched? I frowned. No, I didn't sense any mana from her, except for the fire wisps. I quickly shook my head. Emily? I muttered. Her name was just as strange as she was. Why in the king's name did I have to shout out after her like that? The sudden rush of embarrassment hit me all at once, causing me to cringe inwardly. I quickly took a deep breath and pushed the uncomfortable memory out of my mind. I was definitely bewitched, perhaps some invisible mana even I couldn't see. Yes, that makes more sense. Although I tried to convince myself, my eyes couldn't help but look back toward where the strange Emily had just left. Dangerous, I mumbled. POV, Ether. What are you doing? Brita asked with a groan. Was I loud? I tilted my head, clicking her tongue in annoyance. Brita stood up from her comfortable chair and stretched her limbs before she walked toward me. Loud is an understatement, she replied. My gaze subconsciously glanced at Enos, who was dead asleep. He doesn't count, she retorted before I could even speak. A slight chuckle escaped my mouth. I guess that's true. He can sleep through everything. Brita nodded as she approached the table and scanned the documents I was studying. Do you really have to use mana for that? She asked. I rolled my eyes and replied, in case you haven't noticed, I don't exactly have thumbs now, do I? Brita didn't answer. Instead, her gaze drifted to the map first. What's the point of all of this? She asked. Well, it doesn't hurt to understand the map of the city, I said before pointing to another batch of documents. Those over there explain the structure of the city, I said and motioned to another batch. That one is about the districts, I paused. What? Brita looked at me in confusion. I still can't find anything about that tall pillar we saw when we just came, I answered, a sigh escaping my mouth. Brita shrugged. Since Irvai and Kalta were the ones that sent us here, that means all of these, she said, motioning to the map and documents, are theirs? I nodded in agreement. So, if there is nothing regarding that pillar, tower, or whatever, then that could only mean they don't want us to know about it, she paused. Or they didn't deem it necessary to tell us, she added. If you were that curious, why didn't you ask them about it earlier? In case you haven't noticed, I was busy worrying about bigger matters at the time, I answered sarcastically. Well, you can always ask next time, she said nonchalantly. Aren't you curious about it? No, and I wasn't curious about what I saw in that cave either. And look where that got me, she sighed. I knew I should have stayed in the God's realm. Oh please, you would have been dragged off to the war against the Shades regardless. I rolled my eyes. At least I wouldn't be scared of turning the king into my enemy. True, I couldn't refute that, but think of it this way, it's an adventure, I said. Brita's cold gaze seemed to penetrate my soul. Okay, Okay. I was joking, I hastily replied. But yes, sorry about that, I added. About what? She asked as she began to read one of the documents about the difference between the houses of gods and dragons. You know, all of this. I didn't mean to drag you into this mess, I answered. It was the truth. I liked Brita. She was my first and only friend, and I enjoyed her company. But like she said, now that all of this involved the king, it felt like we were in over our heads. But in my defense, who could have known? Brita dropped the small book she was reading and turned to look at me. Her gaze was sincere. Don't be stupid, she said. Ah, I chose to follow you. It was my decision, and I don't regret it. But dash. She raised her hand to stop me from speaking. You have already saved my life once, and I won't be satisfied until I return the favor. So don't make this awkward, you stupid lizard, she said. A chuckle escaped my mouth. Thank you. Brita rolled her eyes before she turned to leave. Stop pretending to be asleep. I can see you fidgeting, she said and left the hall. Enos stirred on his bed and looked at me with an awkward expression. I'm sorry, brother. I didn't want to interrupt. A bit of a calm chapter today. Gotta give the group a small break before throwing them into the fire. Chapter 448. Fate. Chapter 448. Fate. 3 days have passed since our last meeting with Irvai and Kalta. Lost dropped by our place on the second day, and Enos left with her on a date around the city. Sidis, on the other hand, came back before Emmy did. He occupied one of the tower's rooms and refused to leave. Emmy spent all 3 days basking under the sun during the day and resting in the open hall during the night. Little Essie was quickly bored of just waiting around and doing nothing. So on our third day, she crashed Enos and lost date. This left me and Brita behind. The goddess didn't leave the tower and spent all her time with me, something I was grateful for since I appreciated the company. She didn't speak much and was content to sit there while I went through the various books and documents Irvai and Kalta left behind. Lost and Enos would occasionally bring some snacks. More often than not, it would be chocolate. I don't think you are going to find anything new, Brita spoke, before taking a sip of her tea. I changed the subject and motioned for the tea. Where did you get that from? Little Essie brought it with her, she replied. Some gods sell it out in the city. Lost paid for it, I'm guessing? I believe so, Brita shrugged. She has been spending most of her time with the muscle brain. Yes, pretty cute if you ask me. Brita nodded. It's clear he likes her as well. A small chuckle escaped my mouth, thinking about my little brother's romantic life. Never thought Enos would be the first, I admitted. Brita didn't answer, and instead leaned back on her chair with a satisfied expression on her face. Just then, Sidis walked to the main hall. He gave me a short nod and sat on the large sofa with a soft thud. His expression was strange, and it seemed like he wanted to ask something but was hesitating. I patiently waited for him. Just when it seemed like he gathered enough courage to talk, Emmy walked in. His eyes widened slightly, and he coughed awkwardly. How long are we going to stay here? She asked. I'm enjoying the rest, but it's starting to feel like we are wasting time. I nodded in agreement. I think they should be calling for us anytime soon. I hope so, she paused, her eyes glancing at Sidis. What's with your face? She asked with a raised brow. I don't know what you're talking about, he curtly answered before he stood up to leave. Once he was gone, Emmy turned to look at me with a puzzled expression. What's with him? Beats me, I shrugged. The rest of the day was uneventful. Enos came back at night with a bunch of chocolate snacks again. So, you and Lost, huh? I asked with a wink. Enos nodded confidently before replying, she is strong. I like her. Oh, I didn't expect him to be so straightforward. So is it just because she's strong that you like her? Or? I asked carefully. Enos hesitated for a second. He scratched his head and turned to look at the door where he just come from. I don't know, he answered truthfully. I don't think so, he added after a while. Before I could reply, Enos gave me a nod and hurriedly left for his room to rest for the night. I suppose even he can feel embarrassed, Brita's voice came from the other side of the hall. Aren't you tired of just sitting there all day? I asked. Not at all, she replied with a shrug. The next day, Zephyrion came over. He made his presence known by releasing some of his mana before he carefully landed on the roof. Thankfully, Everyone was already awake and gathered in the main hall. The masked god entered and gave us a respectful nod. "Hello. I hope you've had the chance to rest," he said. "We have. Thank you for the hospitality," I answered with a slight smile. "Great, in that case, if you would be so kind as to follow me. Master Irvai and Mistress Kalta are both waiting for you." I nodded and looked at my siblings and Brita. Everyone stood up at once, ready to leave. "Please lead the way," I answered. The flight back to the temple was smooth, and we soon found ourselves back at its entrance. Zephyrion gave us a nod and motioned for us to head inside while he stood by the entry. With me taking the lead, the others followed behind as we walked in. The surge of cosmic mana surrounded us once more, and I could feel ourselves get transported to what I could only assume was a pocket dimension of sorts. I subconsciously lifted my head. The starry space filled with captivating planets and stars gazed back at me. "It's beautiful," I couldn't help but think. "Welcome back," Kalta's voice boomed in the hall, bringing me back from my reverie. "Thank you," I answered. "I hope you had enough time to enjoy what the city has to offer," she said with a soft smile on her face. I nodded in reply. "Enough with the pleasantries. Let's just get straight to the point," Irvai suddenly interrupted with a frown. Colt rolled her eyes at that, but didn't reply. "You can choose to stay here if you like," the old dragon spoke. His eyes scanned all of us before he continued. "But know this. Now that you have already stepped foot on Faz, you will without a doubt be considered enemies to the king and his faction." A frown took over my face as I stared at the old dragon. "There is no need for you to look at me that way, child," he said while shaking his head. What exactly do you mean?" I asked. "You are not foolish. I'm sure you can understand the importance of what you have seen here." My frown deepened at the implications of his words. I would be lying if I said I didn't expect something like this to happen, but I still had hopes I was wrong. It seems like I was overly optimistic. "I'm afraid he's right," Kalta added in a sympathetic tone. "So what you mean to say is, you forced us to join your cause by turning us into enemies of the king?" Sidis asked in an icy tone. "It was only a matter of time before that happened. Regardless," Irvai replied, "that was not for you to decide." Sidis growled as his aura surged. I can't say I didn't understand his frustration. If anything, all of us were just as equally mad about the entire situation. But now was not the time to start a fight. Especially not here. I quickly sent him a mental message, telling him to calm down. Sidis glared at the dragon and goddess before he turned to me. He seemed to hesitate for a few seconds before forcefully pulling back his aura. Irvai raised his brow and replied, "That's a good child. Know your place." His words further provoked Sidis. But fortunately, Emmy stepped in front of him and whispered something that calmed him down. Kalta sighed in annoyance. "Enough, Irvai. Stop provoking the younglings." The old dragon smirked and shook his head. "They should be grateful we are taking our time to explain everything to them." Kalta ignored him and spoke to us. "Forgive him. He's on the edge lately." I nodded. "You have to understand our frustration in the matter. Everything we have ever known has been turned upside down in a matter of days. I understand, and I wish we had more time, but we don't." "Do you know Syra?" I asked. "The bard?" "Yes, we are familiar with her," the goddess nodded. "She was the one that suggested we come to Faz," I said. Kalta quickly shook her head. "If you are wondering whether or not she has anything to do with this, then no, she doesn't. She has probably sent you here to be safe from the flames of war," the goddess sighed. "So, it's an unlucky coincidence?" I asked with a raised brow. "There is no such thing as a coincidence. You would have found your way here, regardless. Your mana would have guided you," Kalta replied. "Whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, your fate is linked to the mana. And in a sense, to your predecessors," Irvai added. Chapter 449. Retainer. Chapter 449. Retainer. "What is it that you want from us, exactly?" I asked. Kalta seemed to hesitate, but Irvai's eyes shone as he replied. "Join the resistance," he said. Sidis frowned, and I could see him struggling to keep his aura under control. Emmy was no better, an icy expression on her face. Enos, on the other hand, was surprisingly calm with an almost bored expression. Little Essie worriedly glanced at me, and I used my mana to gently pat her head reassuringly. "And if we refuse?" I asked. The old dragon frowned, his eyes bearing into me with unpreceded intensity, before he replied, "Then so be it. You will die, not by our hands. The king and his faction will kill you, and we will continue to wait for the next pillars and pray that they are wiser than you." "You seem very sure of that," I answered. "Child, you seem to misunderstand something. We are not your enemies. We are the pillars' loyal retainers. This city, everything here, is for the sake of helping them fulfill their final wish." Kalta nodded. "The old lizard's words may be crude, but he means no harm, young ones. If you wish to survive, then you must wrest control of your fate from the king and control over your elements. That's the only way we can win." Irvai looked at Sidis and Imi before continuing. "What you two control is but a fraction of the primordial's power. The rest of that power remains within the mana stream." His eyes moved to me. "You," he said, pausing as he stared deep into my eyes. "The seed of cosmic mana is already inside you. You just need to control it." "This is ridiculous," Sidis shook his head. "Denying the truth isn't going to change it." Ivray shook his head. "If you want to live, then you must accept who you are." "I am no traitor." Sidis shot back. "Enough," Kalta interrupted. "1,000 of years waiting, and this is what we get?" Irvai grumbled. "A pillar who grew comfortable with the chains binding him. What a joke." "Watch your words," I growled. Although I had an inkling that the old dragon's words held some truth, but his blatant disrespect had gone too far. "Or what?" he mocked. The cosmic mana in our surroundings seemed to shift, drawn by his response. I didn't understand how he wielded such power, but its danger was palpable. Yet, as an older brother, could I truly retreat? I could sense Sidis, Imi, Enos, and even little Essie's expectant gaze on my back. I exhaled heavily. I didn't want to try this, but it was past time we regained some resemblance of respect from this old lizard. Perhaps sensing my shift in mood, the cosmic elements manifested themselves before me. They seemed to hesitate on whether or not to follow me or follow the old dragon. His eyes held a mocking gleam as he stared at me, but I couldn't care less. I focused my attention on the elements. I was sure he couldn't see them. Whatever power he used to control them didn't afford him the ability to do so. I reached out to them, and they flurried almost excitedly. But some sort of force was bounding them to their place. It was present throughout the entire temple. The sight of it was fascinating. It looked like a web of cosmic mana, interconnected in a way I had never seen before. I exerted my control over it. Before, I was concerned about what might happen if I were to fail, or rather, if we antagonized the old dragon and goddess. Now, however, I didn't care. Why should I care? Why should I take his disrespect? He may be my elder, but he wasn't worthy of disrespecting me or my family. No one was. What sort of dragon would I be if I allowed my fear to control me? Another sigh escaped my mouth. "You know," I spoke slowly. Irvai raised his brow. "Oh, what is this now? Finally grown some fangs? You sitting there all high and mighty really pisses me off." And he chuckled. Kalta, sitting by his side, shook her head but otherwise didn't interfere. "I tried to be civil since we are guests here after all, but my patience has limits." "What are you going to do about it, child?" he asked again, his eyes gleaming dangerously. "First of all," I said, and exerted all my power on that interconnected web of cosmic mana. The previous pillar was dead. I was the only cosmic pillar. His constructs may remain, but they held no power over me. I refused. I forcefully changed the flow of the web. The elements struggled against it. Perhaps if it was when the previous pillar had just died, things might have gone differently, but not now. Not anymore. Whatever influence he still held over this realm, it was only a matter of time before I wrested control over all of it. Irvai's expression suddenly changed as he felt the shift in cosmic mana. Control over the entire temple was still impossible. It needed time, but it would happen. For now, I didn't need to control the entire place. Just momentary control over the hall was all I needed. A savage grin extended and made its way to my face as I spoke. "Let's get you down from there." Irvai tried to speak, but his words died in his mouth as he felt the entirety of cosmic mana in the hall turn against him. His expression turned grim under the pressure, and he quickly tried to retaliate, but it was useless. If it were merely my mana, the impact wouldn't have reverberated so profoundly. However, the cosmic mana permeating this hall, infusing every stone of this ancient temple, was more ancient than all of us. Yervo emitted a mere grunt. The once mighty throne he was coiled around now reduced to shards. With a forceful descent, he met the ground. You say you are the pillar's loyal retainer? Then I suppose it is my duty as your master to teach you manners, I said and slowly walked toward him. Once I was right before him, the old dragon struggled to raise his head under the sheer pressure of cosmic mana. What I was doing was akin to a gamble. Anywhere else, and he would easily flatten me with a sneeze. Here, however, I was a cheat. Do not take my kindness for weakness, Irvai, I added. With a hideous grin, Irvai answered, About damn time. Chapter 450, Truth and Lies. Chapter 450, Truth and Lies. After our little altercation, the old dragon's attitude toward us mellowed down. Although he still kept his annoying grin, he respected our boundaries and never went too far. Sidis still held a strong dislike for the dragon, while Emi's opinion was somewhat neutral. Enos, on the other hand, remained silent and in his own world. Little Essie walked by my side, along with Brita, as we followed behind Kalta and Irvai. Sidis, Emi, and Enos walked in the back. It didn't take long for us before we reached another beautifully carved door oozing with cosmic mana. Kalta and Irvai went through it, and we followed behind. The world changed once more, and we now found ourselves standing on a terrace overlooking the city of Foz. In the distance, the massive tall spire we saw when we just arrived was visible. The multicolored lights emitting from its peak were mesmerizing. Beautiful, isn't it? Kalta smiled. I couldn't help but nod in agreement. It is. What you see there is what keeps the city and this entire plain away from the king's prying eyes. We call it the Eldraliaman Spire. The Eldraliaman, I repeated the name. It was impossible to miss the massive amounts of cosmic mana the spire was emitting. I suppose that answers my question, I added. Kalta nodded in understanding. It is normal for you to be curious about it, she said, and turned to look toward it before continuing. It's considered the primordial's best creation. How so? Emi asked. Kalta turned to face her and answered, Well, dear, the spire shrouds the entirety of the plane in a cosmic veil. What this means is that Foz and Anes, as a whole, do not exist in the same place everything else does. Irvai, who was silent this whole time, spoke. We are in between the astral realm and the normal universe as you know it. Brita's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the astral realm. Her hands began to fidget in search of her non-existent spear. I looked at her, and she seemed to sense my gaze. Our eyes met, and I gave her a comforting nod. It's okay. Brita took a deep breath to calm herself down and nodded back. Good. She was getting better at facing her past. Irvai didn't care about our group's reaction as he continued. That's what makes it nigh impossible to locate Anes. Is that so? I asked, to which he nodded. The spire acts as a guide. It guides back those who are lost outside of Anes here, he paused, shaking his head for a second before adding, I suppose it would be more accurate to say it's the cosmic mana that guides them. Isn't that dangerous? Emi asked with a frown. Dangerous? Irvai raised his brow. Wouldn't the king's faction be able to use that to their advantage? She asked with a frown. It seemed like referring to the king's faction and excluding ourselves from it still left a bad taste in her mouth. Sidis glared at her but otherwise said nothing. Irvai laughed. You don't have to worry about that. If anything, the cosmic mana is on our side. He then turned to Sidis, which is why you need to take back control over your elements. That way, we may stand a chance. Sidis snorted in disdain and didn't reply. What makes you think we stand a chance, though? I asked. Irvai frowned and was about to answer when I interrupted him. According to you, the primordials already tried once, and they failed. And I paused, motioning for all of us. We are weaker than they were. So, why do you think we have a chance of winning against the king? I asked again. You seem to be misunderstanding something. Irvai shook his head. We have no chance of winning against him. Sidis and Emi's eyes widened slightly, while Enos had a grin on his face. Little Essie nervously stared at me, but I was too focused on the old dragon. Then what's the point of all of this? This so-called resistance. Our goal was never to win against the king, dear, Kalta replied. It is to escape. Irvine nodded. Last time, the primordials were alone. This time, you will not be. The terrace fell silent as a small breeze brushed past me, tickling my scales and causing me to take a deep breath. It seemed that I wasn't the only one lost in thought as Sidis, for one, struggled to accept the idea of betraying the king. I could sense his opposition to the plan. Emmy, on the other hand, tried to approach the situation logically, but from the complicated expression on her face, it was clear that it wasn't helping. Essie was nervous, but she tried to maintain a brave front. I gently patted her head with mana, causing her to smile weakly. Even she was aware of the stakes at hand. Brita, next to her, appeared resigned with everything. And Enos was grinning like an idiot. As I turned to look at the spire, memories that I had pushed so far down began to resurface. I didn't know what to do. I was under no illusion that I could face the king and come out on top. Hell, even Irvine and Kalta confirmed it. But that wasn't what bothered me. Do I want to join this resistance? It was a conflicting thought. The king had named me. Not only that, but he was the only one who knew my secret. Even so, was I ready to just roll over and die? No. I had to talk to the king once again. Why did I survive when most others never made it past their naming ceremony? Why did he not have me killed when he had the chance to? Why were we saved from the Shade's territory? Or was everything one big elaborate plan? I didn't know. That is why I intend to find out before anything. So, what is your plan? I asked, breaking the silence. Kalta looked at Irvine and nodded. First things first, we need to regain full control over the darkness and light pillars, he said. Sidis, who was quiet this entire time, spoke. There is something I wish to know. Irvine nodded. What is it? As long as you satisfy my curiosity, I will join this resistance. I raised my brow in surprise. It was clear how adamant Sidis was about this entire plan. What could make him change his mind? I wondered. Sidis turned to face me and gave me a slight nod, which only served to confuse me even more. After the primordials turned against the king, you said only the cosmic pillar survived, correct? Irvine and Kalta both nodded. I see. And were there ever any other darkness or light pillars after them? There were a few, but almost all of them died young. They never reached their full potential. Irvine looked at me and continued. The cosmic pillar was the one that managed to get close, though. I see. And these previous pillars all joined the resistance? Yes, Irvine answered confidently. So, in this generation, we are the only pillars? Yes, that would be correct. I see. Thank you, Sidis smiled. It was a refreshing smile, as if an invisible weight was lifted off his shoulders. He looked at me and lightly nodded. He is lying, brother. His voice resounded in my mind. I controlled my expression and turned to face Irvine and Kalta. I hope that answered all of your questions, Irvine said. It has for now. Good then. In that case, I believe it's time to discuss how you can regain control over the pillars. Indeed, Sidis nodded. He's lying? My mind went into overdrive, trying to understand what Sidis meant when it suddenly clicked. How could I ever forget? Nihilith was still there,